All right. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining the first edition of the Cyber Career Lab. Whether you're listening live or you are listening to the recording, this is the first edition of what I hope is going to be a long series of events that make access to cybersecurity education much easier for all involved. The Cyber Career Lab was created for people who can't afford thousands of dollars for a degree program or for certification training, and our guided lessons, organized into seasons, expose intermediate and beginning security professionals to relevant content and information that equips them to enter the workforce and grow in their careers. We do this by pairing hour-long engaging sessions with great instructors, guest lecturers, and other people in the profession who have already succeeded in their careers and have good information and knowledge to share. If your interest is to join the profession, but you don't know where to get started, this is going to be a good session for you because we're not just covering technical topics, but we're also focusing on professionalism, on resources, on industry associations, and other information that you can use to identify where you want to go in your career, the knowledge, skills, and abilities that are required. And along with these live lessons, we also have a Discord channel that provides access to the team members who are running the program, to the guest lecturers, and to other friends of the program who can answer your questions in a very low stress, high engagement environment. Closing the cybersecurity skills gap is difficult for most people because few organizations focus on early career professionals. Things like Security Plus or CISSP or some of your cloud security certifications require many years of experience, and there really is no way to start the profession as an entry-level person. And so CLASS-LLC is solving this problem by using the resources and relationships that we have, the guests of the program, the knowledge and the information that we have in the industry to allow people to pay what they can afford, whether it is a penny or more, to join us, to grow in knowledge, to be part of the conversation, and to learn the information that you need to be successful. The first guest lecturer that we have is Malcolm Harkins, but hi, I'm Keyaan Williams. I'm the founder and managing director of CLASS-LLC. In my role in the organization, I teach people all over the world, from entry level to executive, to understand how to present security in the context of the business, and that inspires where we are going to start this journey. And so the first season, which is going to include a series of presentations with Malcolm as a guest lecturer, and we have other great people lined up. For the first season, we're really focusing on professionalism and having the right perspective in cybersecurity. And as we go along, we will start to introduce technical concepts, cloud security concepts, encryption, and other critical controls that equip everybody who is a professional to be successful in this industry. Malcolm, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself, and then we can take it away with the lesson?
Hey, thanks, Keyaan. Malcolm Harkins. I have a long and short history in the cybersecurity and tech space. So I've been around it for almost 30 years, spent 24 years at Intel. Most of that was running risk, security, controls, compliance, where I was Chief Security and Privacy Officer worldwide. From there, I went to a cybersecurity startup, Silence, where I was their Chief Security and Trust Officer for 4 years. Again, managing all the internal controls and that type of stuff, but spending a lot of my time in the security industry itself and trying to transform it. Just recently left a web application security company where I was Chief Security and Trust Officer. And now I'm just focused on doing advising, board work, mentoring and coaching folks with my Protect to Enable Ventures effort at this point.
Oh, well, thanks for the introduction. Before we get into the content, again, for the audience, the first episode is going to give a broad overview of information and content that is going to help you have the right perspective about information technology, risk, and security. As we go forward in the program, next week, the week after, throughout the month of June, we'll take a deeper dive into each one of the high-level topics that we talk about today. In terms of ground rules, this is a meeting rather than a webinar because we promote and encourage active engagement. If you're not speaking, please make sure you keep your microphone on mute. If you have something to add, feel free to raise your hand. We'll call on you when it's appropriate. If you have a question that you'd just like to type in the chat, We'll work the answer to those questions in throughout the session. I hope you enjoy the overview. I hope you enjoy the content, and we look forward to your feedback after the session is over. Malcolm, just let me know when you want to go to the next slide, and we'll make it happen.
Great, thanks, Keyaan. So one of the things, again, getting back to perspectives on risk, there's three ways in which you can think about risk. There's risk to the organization you're in. There's risk if you're in a public company, to your shareholders, or even a private company if it's held by shareholders. There's risk to your customers, and then there's societal risk, perhaps, depending upon what the system, the data, and the application itself can do, and the implications of perhaps the misuse of it or malicious activities that occur with it. One of the dialogues that I had a couple years ago, I was giving testimony to the U.S. Senate Commerce and Technology Committee on the promise and perils of emerging technology, and I started with a story. And it's a true story here, and you can see the visualization of it. So if you go back a little bit further than 2015, when this surgery occurred, I think it was in 2013, 2014, the FDA had approved an experimental eye surgery to deal with blindness and degenerative eye disease. In 2019, June 19, 2015, a gentleman in his mid-50s from the Midwest had this eye surgery. So almost 6 years ago, he had this surgery. Again, the idea here was to cure blindness. And so with basically a souped up set of sunglasses, video processing unit, graphics, camera, and basically plugged into the person's brain, the theory was that we would be able to, with technology, start sending different electrical signals into this gentleman's brain and perhaps give them the chance at some portion of their eyesight back. Now, the cool thing about this, again, growing up at the heart of technology at Intel, right, silicon starts with sand, right? So at the base of technology. So I've always believed in the hope and the promise of technology to connect and enrich lives, create economic and social benefit. That's one of the reasons why I've stayed in the tech industry. And this is a great example of where technology can be transformative to people's lives. 90 days after this gentleman had the surgery, harvest moon, going into the fall in the Midwest, asked his wife to take him out back because he had heard on the news, and his wife talked about this amazing harvest moon that was supposed to be out. And he was hoping that he'd be able to see it. So his wife escorts him out into the backyard, helping him out. He looks up to the sky. He doesn't see the moon. A little bit disappointed, obviously. Again, what apparently happened was just the contrast was too great. But when his wife turned him around to bring him back inside the house, I don't know if it was from just the angles, maybe the backlighting from the windows coming out of the house with interior lights on. He looked down as his wife turned him around. He saw images of his wife's face for the first time in 10, 11 years, give or take a little bit. And you go, that's cool. That's the hope and promise of what technology can do. And again, when you think of all this, this really is in many ways just different information technology components put together and then put into somebody's head in order to, again, get them to see things again. Yeah, Keyaan, if you go to the next slide, now that's the promise of emerging technology. Now, having been somebody who's always thought about the possibility of risk, if you think of that individual or somebody 5, 10, 15 years out, perhaps with an advanced version of that capability, or maybe a true bionic eye, 10, 15 years down the road, and the idea here for the malicious actors to extort money. Imagine a QR code in front of that bionic eye, so to speak, and I flip bits a particular way, and I hold that individual, or maybe a whole host of them, hostage to pay in Bitcoin to get their eyesight back. You know, all a bad person needs is poorly designed, developed, implemented, and managed technology and the ability to execute malicious code. You know, if a device can execute code, it has the potential to execute malicious code. And this is where, you know, what I've witnessed, what I've experienced, what I've seen as running security, as well as somebody who's been on the tech side of it, we obviously haven't been doing a fantastic job of mitigating these issues. In fact, Keyaan and I were having some exchange this morning about one of the largest meat processing companies in the world having a ransomware attack issue. We're all susceptible to it. The question is, what are we doing to manage and mitigate these risks? And if you get to things like this, where somebody's life is at stake, where their ability to even see could be compromised, we've got to think about how we're, again, constructing the technology at the beginning, having the right security development lifecycle, right privacy by design to minimize the potential for vulnerability to happen in technology. But since you can't eliminate risk, there's always going to be that potential. So post the design and development, how are we managing the potential for risk, either through added services or components or security technologies? Certainly the hygiene issues that we all have to deal with patching. It becomes all of those complexities that operationally have to be managed. So Keyaan, if you go to the next slide. This brings me to what I call my perfect storm of risk slide. Back in my Intel days, late 2001, so almost 20 years ago, there was a couple events that occurred that I think we're all familiar with. One of them, 9/11, obviously a substantial physical event that impacted the United States and many lives. But logically, in that summer going into fall of 2001, there were two malicious code incidents, Code Red and NIMDA. Now, those created a lot of availability risk issues, a lot of churn in some organizations, Intel included. And after those two events, Andy Grove, who had been one of the founders of Intel, was still running the company at the time. He wrote a book circa 2002, give or take a little bit, probably maybe even earlier than that, called Only the Paranoid Survive. And because he was that way as an individual, hyper paranoid on everything that could affect the business, he created a safety and security task force, holding key executives accountable to deal with the availability risk issues physically and logically. And he met every 2 weeks for multiple hours with these corporate officers. That's when I got pulled in to run security and business continuity in the IT side. And it's not because I had the security expertise or I was a technologist. I was a former finance guy, procurement guy, business operations guy who had grown up in a technology company. So I had a technical acumen, not fingers on keyboards, but I understood the business operations and the technologies that supported it. And I also understood the technologies Intel was creating and putting out to the world. But at that time, Intel had a belief that if they gave me money and budget in a couple of years, I'd programmatically improve the control infrastructure of Intel, and then we'd be able to wind it all back and just kind of flatline it because we were done. Engineering company, you fix it and you move it on. Well, that's really not what I saw that was going to be occurring. And so I drew this slide in early 2002, so several months into running security and business continuity, to kind of explain to Intel's management what I was foreseeing would occur out in the future. Threats, which are the threat actors and threat agents, the hackers, the nation states, you know, the the things that are exploiting vulnerabilities in technology. Those expose our information assets physically, logically, to the key sets of things that we talk about in the security industry: confidentiality, integrity, and availability, causing business impact. My job was to put in place controls to try and mitigate that cycle. Now, the thing that I had to explain to Intel at the time, though it knew it just not consciously in this risk dynamic, is that the asset side of it, information assets physically, logically, their usage models, because Intel was at the heart of creating changes in technology and usage models, were changing. So that aspect of that circle would be evolving. New technology coming out. Again, you can't eliminate risk. So every time you have new technology, you're going to have the potential for vulnerabilities, which means, again, threat actors and threat agents would seek to exploit them. Now, this left-hand side of the diagram, kind of the hidden hand of this perfect storm of risk, was something I drew in here as well. On the geopolitical side, again, if you think of nation states are threat actors and threat agents. So they're feeding the threat and vulnerability cycle. But nation states are also regulatory bodies. They create laws, legislative agendas. And laws create a different type of risk, a compliance risk, a potential liability risk. So you got nation states kind of feeding two aspects of this on the threat and vulnerability side, but also in the legal and compliance risk side of things. Now, what I foresaw, again, and this was ahead of Sarbanes-Oxley, it was ahead of the California breach bill, it was ahead of a lot of the compliance things that we've seen come about in the past 20 years, is that some aspects of my controls would need a level of assurance. Not only for me from a security perspective, but for potential compliance items, we'd need to attest to our control environment, which means I would need more knowledge of Malcolm as a user, his device, his location, his behaviors on the device and on network, what applications, all the things that then have blown into this big identity related set of attributes and behaviors around our users, and whether it be on network, on device, in applications, across those things, between my phone and my laptop, Wi-Fi, all those type of things. All of that information about Malcolm and what he's been doing on systems and on network and with data, all that identity information is necessary to provide a level of assurance that it is Malcolm, it is the device that we gave him, that device is kept up to date and all those things. Now, the other thing though is when you start capturing more of that identity information, a couple things start occurring. You start creating, from the security and other compliance need, a conflict with the potential privacy compliance items, because the more identity information I have on Malcolm, the more privacy risks that I have. The more behavior information I have on Malcolm, the more privacy risk that I have. And so you have, again, this confluence of independent yet interdependent things increasing this perfect storm of risk. And then the other thing is, once we've got more identity information on it, the threat actors and threat agents have been going after that identity information, hence account takeovers, credential theft. So again, you've got this perfect storm of risk that I foresaw 20 years ago. Unfortunately, I think it's what have been experiencing now for several years. But if you think about it, it makes sense. It's a great way to step back and go, what are the macro things that are feeding on each other that are creating the risk cycle that we're seeing? And then how do we then go about what our job is? One, to understand that, but two, put in place controls to manage and mitigate it. Go on to the next slide, Keyaan. So now let's look at some of the stuff with data. Today's reality. So the ISSA is a broad-based association. It's international, but there's chapters around the United States. I've participated in many of their forums. I know Keyaan has too. It's a really great organization to participate in, so I would encourage you guys all to go look up ISSA and perhaps join it. But they periodically would do surveys of cybersecurity professionals, people internal to companies managing information risk and security. One of the polls that they've done, again, a number of times, but it almost comes out pretty consistent each time, is they'll ask them about their perspective on their organizations and how vulnerable they are. And half of us who've managed or been a part of the internal security teams in an organization say that our organizations are significantly vulnerable. Half of us say that we're somewhat vulnerable. And now that's pretty startling, because that says that as a profession, we are 100% vulnerable. Now, when I look at this through a different lens, and for those of you that are new into this space, you know, this might be some new information for you. But if you look at the way in which we define risk, it's risk as a function of threat, which is again those threat actors and threat agents, vulnerability, you know, the systems and data vulnerable, and then consequence. So what's the impact? And I already mentioned the impact to who, you know, is it to the organization, customers, society? But risk is a function of those things. When you look at that mathematical equation, the only controllable variables in that equation are how vulnerable we are. The threat actors and threat agents, we have no ability to affect in any way. A nation state could, law enforcement could. You might be able to play with some insider risk a little bit depending upon your culture and your company. But by and large, we can't affect, as security professionals running security in an organization, the threat variable. Consequence or impact is what it is based upon your dependence upon technology. So the only thing that we're responsible for is managing how vulnerable our organizations are. And if you look at these stats, it basically says we're not doing a good job because we're somewhat to significantly vulnerable, which is a sad reality. And then again, we'll talk about why that might be the case as we go a little bit further on. Now, getting to societal risk and some of these broader things beyond just, you know, data loss or, you know, other impacts, you know, my factory being shut down for a couple hours because of a ransomware, those certainly have an impact. But when you look at worldwide societal risk, the World Economic Forum, if you're not familiar with it, it happens every February. It's been going on for a couple decades. They have a World Economic Forum risk report that they publish every year, and it measures a wide variety of things. And cyber risk has been in the top several risk categories for the world, and certainly the #1 business risk now for 4 going on 5 years running. And it's up there with risks like aging population, climate change, wealth disparity. So it really is a societal risk. And so you'll hear me say this, you know, a lot if you look at things that I do. We got to go beyond just the financial impact of the risk and look at it and figure out if we're having a bigger impact beyond it. And the reason why I use that example beyond just the financial side, some of you that are old enough or been around since at least the 70s will remember the Ford Pinto. You know, Lee Iacocca was running the Ford Pinto division, and it shipped cars for several years. You know, I don't think Ford, I don't think Lee Iacocca was trying to harm people, but I think the way in which they framed the risk, they looked at it from a financial lens. They looked at it from what's the financial impact to the bottom line. And that removed the human element of the risk, which I think is what then caused them to be less than focused on people on the other side of it. And so again, I would implore you, as you look at your careers in this space, we've got to do the financial side of it, absolutely. But if there's a human aspect to it or societal aspect to it, to somebody that could be harmed, much like the story that I started with the gentleman, or some future individual that might have a prosthetic cyber eye, bionic eye at some point, to think about the implications if that was to be hacked or maliciously taken over. It causes you to think about the risk dynamics differently. If you go on to the next slide, Keyaan. This brings me to a model, again, that I started developing when I was back at Intel. I was 5-6 years into my role running, information risk and security, and Intel's chief information officer that I worked for at the time, because if you looked at the first dozen years of my career, I changed jobs every 12, 18 months, and I was already 4-5 years into running risk and security at Intel. And Intel CIO was worried that I'd get bored, just given my my prior propensity for finding new challenges and wanting to do new things. And so we sat down, we're having a career development discussion, and they were explaining they were worried about the fact that I'd get bored in security. And I'm like, I don't think that's gonna be the case, because there's all these multi-dimensional aspects that I constantly need to grow on. And they got it, but so I went to this whiteboard and said, there was a design company in the 70s and 80s, they're probably still around, called IDEO. Again, growing up in the tech sector, people remembered IDEO, and I was like, remember how they had this model of the ideal technologist? They had at the top of the T a breadth of business acumen, and then the post making the T was their technical depth. And that's what was seen as the ideal technologist for many years, and certainly in the tech sector. And IDEO put out the model and stuff, and CIO is like, yep, you're absolutely right. That's the ideal technologist. And that's why I'm worried, Malcolm, because your breadth is just in one spot. And I was like, no, you're looking at it wrong. It's like for information security professionals, and certainly as an organization as a whole, but certainly as you try and raise your career and you become more senior, you need to be Z-shaped. And so I took the T and I turned it into the Z-shaped model. I was like, I always have to grow my breadth of business acumen. That's my value to the business. That's my understanding of business processes, how the organizations make money, the economic and other competitive things that they're forced to deal with. Because if I don't have that business acumen breadth, then my value to the business, my value to interact with it and influence it will diminish. So I have to constantly grow that. On the technology side, I go, instead of being deep, I also need to have a breadth of technical acumen. And that's my ability to communicate, influence, have value, not only on the IT side of the house, but as we've seen, the OT side, so the operational technology that's used in factories and pipelines and all that stuff, but also in the product side, because many organizations beyond the traditional tech sector, boy, tongue twister there, are creating technology. They're creating web apps, they're creating websites, they're embedding technology into physical goods and services. So those are all different, but that's a breadth of technical acumen that I have to understand those and interact with the technologist. And then what I've got to continue to do is grow my risk and security and compliance depth. And then I have to connect the business side and the technical side with that risk acumen and that compliance acumen, that security acumen. It's like, so how could I ever be bored? I've got this multi-dimensional thing that I've got to grow myself in, and I've got to grow my organization in. Why? To be able to manage that perfect storm of risk. And then surrounded by it, I also have to have beyond reproach values. Not just the values that the company might have and the compliance things that we all have to see and do, but we have to have a different level of, again, beyond reproach. A lot of companies instantiate these in, again, corporate values, but some of them are not as obvious. We'll certainly see integrity in them, we'll see accountable in them, but we also have to have a level of independence, which means we have to be courageous and sometimes, step up and tell other business executives, this isn't happening. This is not an acceptable risk. And that's also where people get confused between a business process, which is reviewing risk and accepting risk, but accepting risk is not a control. It's a business process, it's a decision. It doesn't mean even if we've accepted risk, we still are accountable to managing it if the risks actually manifest themselves. And again, you've got to be sometimes selfless. So there's a different perspective that I have on managing risk. I think the best risk managers are the best risk takers. And as a profession, we don't do a good job of taking risk. Why? Because our job is to manage and mitigate it. And so I've long believed that we have to run to the riskiest things to shape the path of the risk. Because if we don't, we're always going to be behind the business or behind the technologists who are going to be out at the edge doing risky things. And I've always believed and tried to manage my teams to be at that edge of risk and be the earliest adopters of the riskiest things, because then it's easiest for us to manage and mitigate that risk and define a path for the business versus reacting to the path. Keyaan, if you go to the next slide. This brings me to my 9 box of controls. It's a control framework. It's a control philosophy, strategy. Again, if you go back up like 100,000-foot view level of the world and you go, what are the ways in which you can control for risk? You can prevent it, detect it, and respond to it. As you go from prevention to response, risk grows. Now, there's different ways in which you can apply controls. You can automate controls, do semi-automated, meaning that people are in the middle of it, or it can be purely a manual control. And this could be physical controls, it could be cybersecurity controls, it could be financial controls, it could be procurement controls, it almost doesn't matter. But as you go from automation to manual, cost grows. Why? Because you're throwing bodies at it and it takes longer. And so when you think about it, prevention is the only true form of minimizing vulnerability and thus the potential for harm. Damage minimization controls, and this is where the industry gets it confused at times. Sometimes we confuse it, but detection and response, they're necessary controls, but they're damage minimization controls. When you're detecting and responding, bad things are already starting to happen. And so you're trying to minimize the damage or the extent to which that harm gets created. Now, as an industry, we're mostly focused on semi-automated to manual detection and response. And again, this goes back to the ISSA survey stuff, where we're somewhat or significantly vulnerable by our own admission, which means that we're doing a lot of detection and responding, and we're doing it in manual to semi-automated ways. And that's the highest risk, highest cost, most liability for our organization. So what I always try and promote is a control strategy, a control philosophy that you constantly are shifting left to more and more automation to lower cost. And then you're constantly looking at the things you're responding to or detecting and trying to, again, move down into how do I prevent those risks from happening? Why? Because again, if I'm responding, I'm at high risk. If I'm doing it manually, I'm high cost, right? In that upper right quadrant. So you got to go shift left, shift down. Now there's third dimension here. So this actually should be a 27 box diagram, but I can't draw that well. Controls are a drag coefficient. They create friction. They slow down people, data, and business processes, chew up unnecessary compute cycles. I don't know any end user who says the security control improved their ability to do their job. None. And I would venture to say if you looked at your own environments or looked at the other things that you might experience security controls, you go, it slowed you down, right? That friction does two things. In some organizations, they are salute and execute. They will adhere to the control. Now, when the friction of the control is high enough and you adhere to the control, you just slowed down business velocity. And if you slowed down business velocity, you just increased cost, you increased business risk. That's a systemic risk to an organization if you slow down velocity. Now, that's a going out of business proposition. The other state of many organizations or end users, if the control gets in their way, they go around the control. Now, what happens if people go around the control? Well, you just wasted time, you wasted money because you spent money on something to only drive your users and business around it. Why? Because the friction was so high. So the other thing we have to do when we're evaluating controls and looking at the design of them and the implementation of them is how do I minimize the friction? Because I don't want the business risk and I don't want people going around the control. So sometimes that's a variable that we can design for. Sometimes that's a variable we can play with. Sometimes we can use friction in a way that actually improves velocity. I'll give you an example. Formula One, races. The spoiler on the back and the curvature on the front, they create downdrafts to keep the car on the track. So you can design physical controls for adhesion to the mission, keeping the car moving as fast as possible, as safe as possible. I believe that we can design technology controls that same way that aid in improving business velocity rather than impede business velocity. But that's up to us to design them. It's up to us to deploy them that way. It's up to us to demand solutions that do that from the security industry. Keyaan, if you go to the next slide. So I've been around this industry now for a couple decades as a practitioner, certainly in the tech sector for years before that. But I love the tech sector. I love the risk, security, privacy industries, and careers in them are limitless. I've seen it for myself. I've seen it with people I've mentored. I've seen it with people that have been in my organizations, and how many of even folks that worked in my team at Intel are now chief information security officer somewhere, doing things, which is just amazing. But the question becomes, where to start, how to navigate your path. So lessons that I've learned over the years that hopefully, something that you guys can think about and use for yourself. Hard work beats talent that doesn't work so hard. I'm not a technologist. Last time I wrote code was in Fortran in the 80s. So I'm not a fingers on keyboard technologist. Doesn't mean I don't understand what connects to what, how it works. the architectural problems, the risk problems, the opportunities that can come from amazing technology. So if you're in the category that, you're, not a hands-on technologist, it doesn't matter. You can work hard, continually learn, and make a difference. So, and I think this is true both in the tech sector and the security, but it's a life lesson. Hard work beats talent. It doesn't work so hard. There's a lot of really smart people who don't work hard, and their impact on their life, their impact on the organizations they work for, will be muted because of that. The other thing that I've learned, again, it's true, especially in this space, but I think it's a good life lesson. Speak in such a way that others want to listen to you, and listen in such a way that others want to speak to you. Go back to my Z-shaped. How do you have influence? How do you have impact with the technologist, with the business, with other aspects, legal, finance, audit? You've constantly got to be listening to people's needs, their issues, their problems, their hopes, their business objectives, and you got to be curious about it and genuinely want to help them achieve what their mission is. And then you've got to, again, speak to them in ways that get them to understand the risk issues that you foresee, the types of things that you believe that need to be done to manage and mitigate those risks. And if you do that, I think you're going to have a better time moving the needle, navigating between the business, the risk, the technology. And then the last aspect of this, I've managed my career on three things: luck, timing, and execution. Execution gets back to hard work. It's the only thing I can control, is how well I can execute. And my execution is based upon what I know, my capabilities, my capacities, and applying them well. Timing, it's like the Wayne Gretzky saying, go where the puck is going, not where it's been. Again, the more you can position yourself and get good about thinking out strategically where the business is going, where risks are going, where you want to go, you'll actually get good at timing. And if you get good at timing, you'll be able to develop your own luck. And frankly, if luck works against you, if you're sufficiently agile, you'll be able to flip an unlucky item where you're on your heels into something where you've catapulted yourself. We've all been experiencing the pandemic for well over a year now. I saw some organizations that, again, they were well prepared for pandemics. I think my former employer was, partly because I was helping build pandemic response plans in 2002 when I was back at Intel. But for even some organizations that weren't well prepared for it, and so luck worked against them and just what was happening in the world, I saw some IT organizations, some CISOs, use it as an opportunity to leapfrog when they had to send everybody home and work remotely, and transform their security architecture in ways that enabled business velocity versus just perpetuate some dated controls and dated technology approaches towards remote management that many did. So again, whether things work for you or against you, we all have the opportunity, even if something negative happens that was unforeseen, to take that bad luck and turn it into good luck if we're agile enough. And then I think the last thing here, again, it's a life lesson. I'm a hopeful person, I'm a purpose-driven person, but regardless of whatever path you choose, I'd encourage you to, again, go to bed with a dream, wake up with a purpose. If you don't have a sense of purpose, you don't have a sense of passion, you don't have a sense of curiosity in what you're doing day in and day out, it's a grind. If it's a grind, it's not fun. you know, we will all have days and jobs and managers and organizations we've worked for where it's a grind and it's taken its toll. But I think by and large, if you can think this way, act this way, you'll find your path a little bit better. And I think the path on the risk and security side of it has a strong purpose. It should be something that is compelling for all of us to do. And with that, I think, Keyaan, we've probably got time for Q&A, and I'm sure if people don't have questions, you'll pepper me.
Yeah, and it's the goal of this conversation, again, for those of you who joined us late, is to start a long-term exploration for what it takes to be successful in the cybersecurity profession. And so if you have questions, go ahead and raise your hand, or you can type them in the chat. As Malcolm was going along, he presented interesting points of reference. So I posted the links to those references in the chat, and those will be available to you. We will repost them on Discord. For the time being, because I don't see any hands or any questions, if you approach this from the academic sense, there's a lot of information that we can unpack from this session. Number one, it's really understanding risk. We had a 40-minute conversation about risk, and if you don't understand the definition of risk and the goal of risk and the context of risk, it's going to be difficult to share this conversation with other people. And so if you failed to take notes, and if you don't want to go back and listen to the entire recording, you're really just talking about a tool that helps you measure uncertainty. Now, in a business sense, risk can be positive or negative. We're just talking about uncertainty. And so if I were doing a construction project, there is a risk, some level of uncertainty, that we're going to finish a component early, and then people are going to be paid to sit around and do nothing because they're not ready for the next step. And so thinking about the impact of risk on the businesses that you support, whether it's a school, whether it's a library, whether it's a hospital, or any other type of organization, is going to be very important. One of the most important things that you can do as a security professional is put risk that you understand in a context that's relevant to the organization. And so usually in security, risk is always something negative, where they focus on the likelihood that a motivated and capable attacker is going to exploit a vulnerability or a weakness in the environment, whether it's a software weakness or a network security weakness or some other control. And then through that exploitation, they're going to gain access to information or to systems, or some harm is going to happen because people are hurt or data is lost or you violate a regulatory requirement. And so the more time you spend learning how to communicate risk and contemplate risk and understand risk and present it in a way that is meaningful to the people who are receiving the information, the better off you're going to be professionally, the more valuable you're going to be to your organization, and the more people are going to want to talk to you because they recognize that you're saying things that people really care about and you're providing information that people can do something with. From a timing perspective, in the absence of questions, I think timing is a good concept to consider because this is a great time to be alive, you know, for not applying cliches. But if you're thinking about getting into cybersecurity and you're at the beginning of your career, this is a good time to learn and master cloud security. There are numerous initiatives that are happening in organizations where they're thinking about digital transformation. They're getting rid of old technology. They're going to places like Microsoft or Google or Amazon to dump their data center, which is very expensive, and put all of their applications and their services, their solutions and their data in somebody else's environment. Doing that has a level of risk or uncertainty associated with it, and it really just takes some time, some attention, and some dedication to learn what you need to learn and master what you need to master so that you can be a competent cloud security specialist. And it doesn't require 20 years of experience. I know some people that have done very well just having 3 or 4 years of experience because they took the time that was necessary to master one of the cloud environments, to master the controls, to be able to communicate risk and provide value for the organization. This is also a good time to learn and master network security and communications. Anybody who is listening live or listens to the recording who had to do remote access because of the pandemic probably is going to have some recognition of the fact that this is not the most secure way to gain access to the organization's environment or to its data. And the more you can communicate about secure network communications and secure remote access and controlling who can access what environments, especially when people are connecting from home or from coffee shops like Starbucks or from other remote locations, the value of that knowledge of network security and communication security is only going to increase over time. Malcolm referenced the World Economic Forum, and they had a study that was out a couple of years ago that said by 2030 or 2040, the number of people who transition from manual workers and manual labor to white collar information workers was going to take a meaningful amount of time. And now they went back and revisited that study and said because of the pandemic and because of the number of people who had to find ways to work remotely from home, the acceleration in the pace with which we are having more and more knowledge workers is also going to increase how important it is that you can do network security and communication security. My final nugget when we talk about timing, and then we'll transition to the finish line, is that this is also a good time to master effective business communication. When I went and got my master's degree, my first master's that I was going to get was a master's of science in computer science, and my first class was programming. My second class was building networks, and we got into all kinds of technical things. But I went back and I looked at the entire curriculum for the course, and there was no business discussion whatsoever in a master's program that was focusing on cybersecurity. But the people who make all of the decisions, the people who provide the budget, the people who decide where are we going and how are we going to get there are often non-technical business people who don't spend entire degree programs or decades of their time learning how to master technology, especially from a security perspective. They spend all of their time learning how to master good business practices. We increase sales, we increase marketing, we do things that are going to generate additional revenue and value for the organization. So the time that you learn, or the time that you spend to learn how to present security information in a business context is going to set you miles ahead of other people at your level who are going for the same types of jobs. You know, if you think about the impact of a ransomware attack on a beef manufacturer, Malcolm has a great story that we'll revisit in another session about a security executive who didn't understand the business context for cybersecurity for a meat processing organization. And so it's not really about compliance requirements or regulatory requirements or having a catalog of security controls that you put in place, but it really, at the end of the day, when you're dealing with meat, boils down to food safety and what level of confidence do you have that somebody hasn't tampered with the food so that you're poisoning thousands of people and then everybody dies, and that would be a horrible consequence or a horrible outcome. And so for every type of organization that you're working in, whether it's a not-for-profit, whether it's a ministry, whether it's a library or school or whatever it is, knowing what's driving the organization, what their priorities are, what really gets the stakeholders and the leaders excited, the answer to those questions are what you need to focus on when you're presenting and communicating the security information, because it's going to help make a difference and help them point things in the right direction. And so we didn't have any questions that came up for this session, but Malcolm will be back as a guest lecturer for a few more sessions in June. Intentionally, we did a high-level overview of some very important topics, but understanding risk is the foundation for what you're going to do as a security professional, regardless of what you focus on, regardless of what you prioritize, whether it's technical security, whether it's network security, whether it is identity and access management, whatever you choose to focus on, understanding risk and how risk relates to your work is going to be very important. And so for the next couple of weeks in the series, we're going to take a deeper dive into things that we talked about today, starting with the 9 box of controls so that we can make sure that everybody understands it and can communicate it and can make a difference. For those of you who are not yet in the profession, this is going to be a great foundation when you go to an interview, because you're going to blow the socks off of the person that you're talking to, and they're going to say, wow, this person really gets it. I really want them on the team, because they're not just regurgitating things that you see in marketing and vendor materials, but you're really communicating a detailed understanding of what is important and what the business cares about. If this is your first time hearing about the Cyber Career Lab and you did not get here through the website, just as a reminder, the goal of the program is really to transform the careers and the lives of people who are early in their security career or who are trying to join the security profession. Step one in the process, please consider joining our Discord channel. The link to the Discord channel is on the website, www.class-llc.com/CCL. In the Discord community, we'll post all the links that came up in the conversation. Our guest lecturers have access to drop in additional nuggets of wisdom, and it is a good opportunity to keep the conversation going from week to week. On the website, you can also register to attend each weekly session. Our priority in this adventure is education. And so we're not going to send you a bunch of solicitations and try to sell you things, but every week, if you register, you'll get notification about what's coming, what's going on, what you missed. If you register for a session and couldn't attend for some reason, by registering, you'll also get an email that gives you a direct link to the recording. All of this is meant to ensure that you receive the maximum value from the time that you're willing to invest to participate. Each one of the sessions that we do for the Cyber Career Lab is recorded. And so what you can expect is that by 9 o'clock on the following day, you'll get a notification on YouTube if you subscribe to the YouTube channel, or you'll get the email with a link to the video. So if you missed something, or if you want to share the information with your friends, your family, and your colleagues, the recordings are a great way to revisit the content and continue to expand your learning. The way that we set this up, as I said in the beginning, is to remove price as a barrier that prevents people from joining the security profession. Most often, you have to get a degree in cybersecurity that can cost thousands of dollars depending on the university or the institution that you go to. Some people start with cybersecurity certifications, but those certifications also have a cost associated with them. For example, if you decided to get Security Plus, you're looking at $3,000 to $3,500 to do training to pass a test, but you still don't understand how to apply the knowledge in the real world. And where education and certifications have their place, it is still important to have access to information that is going to help you understand how does this work, how do you apply the knowledge, and your ability to apply the knowledge and information is what's going to make the greatest difference for your success. If you enjoyed this, whether you're listening live or you listen to the recording and catch up on the video on YouTube, this is a community effort, so I appreciate your willingness to share your experience, to share the content, and to share the information with your family, your friends, and your colleagues. It will be a great way to get more people involved in the process. And as a final note, I'd like to thank you, especially if you joined us live. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for listening. Thank you for what you thought about asking, but failed to ask it live. You still have the opportunity to post the questions in the Discord channel, and I look forward to meeting you there and interacting. On behalf of CLASS-LLC, on behalf of Malcolm Harkins, I am Keyaan Williams. I thank you for joining us today, and I look forward to seeing you at the same time next week as we take a deeper dive into the 9 box of controls. Thank you very much.